Hey there, sleepy wasteland wanderers. Tonight, we're diving into the haunting beauty of the Fallout universe, where broken cities whisper forgotten stories, and every shadow hides a tale of survival. I'll be your guide through these glowing ruins, sharing quiet moments of hope, resilience, and the eerie calm of a world long gone. So, get cozy, dim the lights, and let the hum of your Pip-Boy light our way. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out our full Fallout playlist for more sleepy stories from the wasteland. And if there's a Fallout tale you want to hear next, drop it in the comments. Now, close your eyes, breathe deep, and drift into the world of Fallout, where dreams wander just beyond the horizon. Welcome, wanderer of the wasteland, to the cold and honest reckoning with what happened at the top of the world. Tonight, we do not follow the simulation. We follow the truth, the specific, costly, human truth of what the Alaskan front actually was, what it required of the people sent there, and what the civilization that sent them chose to remember and chose to forget. This is not the story the recruitment posters told. It is the story the soldiers carried home in their bodies and their silences. Settle in, let the warmth find you, let the cold of Anchorage remain where it belongs in history, in the honest dark. Close your eyes, let us begin. The world does not arrive at its final wars suddenly. This is among the most consistent observations available from any serious examination of how civilizations reach the point at which their disputes are prosecuted through the application of military force at the largest scale there. Remaining resources can support the observation that the final war is never a rupture in an otherwise healthy system, but the terminal expression of pressures that have been building for long enough that the people living within the system have had years, in some cases decades, to observe the trajectory and to understand, at some level, they could not always fully articulate where it was leading. The Anchorage front did not emerge from a stable world that was suddenly destabilized by an act of Chinese aggression. It emerged from a world that had been destabilizing for a generation, whose resource base had been declining for longer than that, and whose political and economic systems had been responding to that decline through a progressive militarization of competition that made the eventual deployment of actual military force not a departure from the preceding pattern but its logical continuation. The petroleum that had powered the first century of industrialized civilization was not a resource whose exhaustion arrived without warning. The warnings had been accumulating since the middle of the 20th century, issued by scientists and economists and engineers whose professional engagement with the mathematics of extraction and consumption produced conclusions that the political and economic systems of the nations consuming the resource had found various ways to defer, discount, and ultimately ignore until the deferral became impossible because the physical reality of the resource's depletion had advanced to the point where no amount of institutional management could prevent it from appearing in the operational data as an undeniable constraint on everything that depended on petroleum's continued availability. By the middle of the 21st century, the deferral was over. The petroleum was effectively gone in the sense that mattered most practically, not absent from the planet's geology in any absolute sense, but present in quantities and locations that made extraction costs prohibitive for the scale of consumption that the world's industrialized economies required to continue functioning at anything approaching their previous level of activity. What remained was distributed with a radical inequality that had been a feature of petroleum geography from the beginning, but that had become, as the total available supply contracted, a source of the specific kind of geopolitical tension. That scarcity of essential resources reliably generates the tension between the nations that possessed the remaining deposits and the nations whose survival as functioning industrial societies depended on accessing them. The resource wars that began formally in 2052 with the European Commonwealth's invasion of the Middle East were not the beginning of the conflict over what remained of the world's petroleum. They were the moment when the conflict crossed the threshold From the economic and diplomatic forms it had been taking, the trade agreements and the sanctions, and the competitive pricing strategies, and the proxy conflicts, and the farthest political pressures applied through various institutional channels into the military form that all resource competition eventually takes when the stakes are high enough and the available alternatives have been exhausted. The European Commonwealth's decision to invade was not a departure from rational calculation, but its expression, the conclusion, reached through exactly the kind of cost-benefit analysis that rational actors apply to their available options. That military acquisition of the remaining Middle Eastern oil deposits was preferable to the economic and political consequences of operating without adequate petroleum supply. That the invasion would produce casualties, that it would generate international condemnation, that it would accelerate the militarization of competition, that it was itself an expression of. These were costs that the calculation had assessed and judged acceptable against the alternative. The alternative was the collapse of the industrial civilization that the petroleum had been sustaining, and the collapse of industrial civilization was not, in the assessment of the people making the decision, an acceptable outcome. China's situation in the decades leading to the Anchorage campaign was the situation of the resource war's most consequential participant, a nation of more than 1 billion people whose industrial capacity had been developed across decades of extraordinary economic growth to a scale that its domestic resource base was catastrophically insufficient to sustain. The specific arithmetic of China's resource situation in the years before Anchorage is among the clearest illustrations available of the mechanism through which the resource wars were produced, not through the evil intentions of particular leaders or the inherent aggressiveness of particular cultures, but through the specific logic of a situation in which the gap between what a civilization required to continue functioning and what its accessible resources could provide had reached a magnitude that made military acquisition of external resources not a choice between acceptable and unacceptable options, but a choice between different forms of catastrophe. Economic collapse, the specific form of civilizational catastrophe that resource exhaustion produces when military acquisition is not pursued, was not an abstract possibility for China's leadership in the years before Anchorage. It was a visible trajectory, documented in the economic data, manifesting in the social pressures of a population whose expectations had been formed in conditions of growth and whose experience was now of contraction, and carrying political implications that the leadership understood with the specific clarity of people whose continued hold on power depended on their ability to manage a situation that was becoming progressively less manageable through the instruments of ordinary governance. Alaska's specific relevance to this situation was the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, the infrastructure that connected the Prudhoe Bay oil fields on Alaska's north slope to the port at Valdez, providing the United States with a domestic petroleum supply that the resource war's disruption of Middle Eastern production had made more strategically significant than at any previous point in its operational history. The pipeline represented something that both the United States and China understood with the specific clarity that comes from examining the same set of facts through the lens of opposite interests, a resource asset whose control would materially affect the balance of the resource competition that the resource wars had made explicit. For the United States, the pipeline was a domestic supply that the nation's increasingly strained resource situation required to protect at all costs. For China, the pipeline was an adversary's strategic asset whose disruption or capture would simultaneously address China's own resource requirements and degrade the adversary's capacity to resist Chinese strategic objectives in the resource requirements. Broader competition. The decision to send People's Liberation Army forces into Alaska was, in this accounting, not a decision driven by territorial ambition or ideological hostility, but by the specific resource arithmetic of a civilization, doing what civilizations do, when survival and expansion require the same action pursuing the resource. Through the most direct available means, when the less direct means had been exhausted. The United States, that received the Chinese invasion of Alaska, was not the confident superpower of the 20th century's middle decades, was not a nation whose material and institutional resources were adequate to the challenge without significant strain and significant sacrifice. It was a nation already under the specific pressures that the resource wars had been generating across the preceding 2 decades, fuel rationing that had been in effect long enough to have become a feature of daily life rather than an emergency measure, food prices elevated by the agricultural sector's dependence on petroleum-derived inputs to points that made genuine nutrition inaccessible to significant portions of the population, and a political culture that had been managing the growing gap between the civilization's stated values and its actual operational reality through the specific mechanisms of propaganda and institutional denial that pre-war America had developed into something approaching an art form. The decision to defend Alaska with the full military force available was not made from a position of comfortable strategic advantage. It was made from the position of a government that understood, with the specific clarity of people whose access to the actual numbers made comfortable self-deception impossible, that the loss of the pipeline infrastructure would accelerate the resource crisis that was already threatening the civilization's continued functioning to a point that the political consequences would be unmanageable. What both sides were doing at Anchorage, stripped of the nationalist framing that each applied to its own participation in the conflict, was prosecuting a resource war through military means, because the resource competition that the world's declining petroleum supply had made the central organizing fact of international relations in the mid-21st century had reached a stage at which military force was the most direct instrument available for determining which civilization would have access to the remaining supply and which would not. This is not a comfortable observation, because the comfortable observation is the one that the propaganda of both sides preferred, the one that located the conflict in the moral qualities of the adversary, in the aggression of the Chinese, or the imperialism of the Americans, or whatever framework of moral evaluation each side's information apparatus had constructed to give its population a reason to support the killing that resource. Competition had made necessary. The uncomfortable observation is the one that the full account makes unavoidable, that both sides were doing what any civilization does when its survival requires a resource that another civilization controls, that the specific moral frameworks deployed to justify the conflict were the specific moral frameworks that the specific institutional interests on each side required, and that the soldiers who were sent to the cold of Alaska to kill each other and die were the instruments of a calculation that neither side's propaganda gave them adequate information to evaluate. The Anchorage front existed in this accounting, not because either nation was uniquely evil or uniquely aggressive, but because the specific combination of resource scarcity and the specific vulnerability of a specific piece of infrastructure in a specific geographic location had created the conditions under which military force was the most direct available instrument for resolving the competition. The people sent to prosecute that competition in the cold, the American soldiers in their power armor and their standard issue cold weather gear, the Chinese soldiers maintaining an occupation in conditions that had not been adequately anticipated by the planning that had sent them there, were not the authors of the calculation that required them to be there. They were its instruments, its material expression, the specific human beings whose lives and bodies and minds were the currency in which the resource competition was ultimately settled. Understanding what happened to them and what the conditions of the Alaskan front produced in the people who endured it requires first understanding the world that made their presence there not just possible, but in the specific logic of a civilization managing the final phase of its resource crisis, necessary. That understanding is what the preceding account has been building toward. The rest of this chronicle will examine what the necessity actually cost the people required to pay it. Anchorage did not fall in a single dramatic assault that the propaganda could frame as a moment of overwhelming force, meeting heroic but insufficient resistance. It fell the way most cities fall to military occupation, through the specific combination of strategic surprise, material advantage, and the particular vulnerability of a position whose defenders had not been resourced to the level that the position's strategic importance warranted, because the people responsible for resourcing it had made the assessment that the Chinese would not actually move and had been wrong. The People's Liberation Army forces that crossed into Alaska had been preparing for the operation with the specific thoroughness of a military that understood it was committing to a campaign from which withdrawal would be politically catastrophic, that had done the logistical and tactical planning that the distance from its supply base and the difficulty of the terrain required, and that arrived at the operational theatre with sufficient force to achieve the initial objective of securing Anchorage and the pipeline infrastructure connecting it to the North Slope fields before the American military's response could be organized and deployed at the scale the situation demanded. The occupation was established before the defense was ready. This is how occupations begin, not through the defeat of an adequate defense, but through the exploitation of the gap between the threat's arrival and the defense's preparation. A gap that the strategic miscalculation on the American side had left open long enough for the occupation to become a fact on the ground that the subsequent American military response would have to address as an entrenched position rather than an ongoing invasion. The city that the People's Liberation Army occupied was not a military installation or an industrial facility, but a populated civilian community, a city of ordinary people who had been living ordinary lives in an Alaskan urban center and who found themselves, with the arrival of Chinese forces, inside a military occupation zone whose organizational logic was not their organizational logic and whose purposes were not their purposes. The specific experience of an Anchorage civilian in the early weeks of the occupation was the specific experience of a person whose environment had been reorganized around requirements entirely external to their own life, whose movements were governed by curfews established for military purposes, whose access to food and fuel and the other material necessities of daily life was mediated by the occupation authorities' decisions about what the civilian population required relative to what the military force required, and whose understanding of their own situation was shaped by whatever information the occupation authority chose to make available, alongside whatever information they could gather through the informal channels that occupied populations always develop as alternatives to the official information environment. The specific texture of life under occupation is not primarily dramatic. It is primarily a matter of daily management, of circumstances that have been rendered uncertain in ways that pre-occupation life had not required managing the uncertainty about whether the curfew would be enforced tonight, how strictly, whether the food distribution would be adequate to what the household required, whether the specific behavior that had been acceptable yesterday would be acceptable tomorrow under whatever the occupation authority's current interpretation of its own rules happened to be. The Chinese military personnel who administered the occupation of Anchorage were human beings in specific circumstances that the American propaganda's dehumanization of the enemy was specifically designed to make unavailable to the American public's moral consideration. They were soldiers, far from home, operating in a climate that the majority of them had not been trained for and had not previously experienced, maintaining a position that their strategic planning had envisioned holding for a limited period, while the resource objectives that the campaign had been designed to achieve were secured, and that they were instead holding for months and then years, as the American military's response developed and the front lines stabilized into the sustained engagement that neither side had fully anticipated. The specific hardships of a Chinese soldier maintaining the Anchorage occupation were not the heroic hardships of a propaganda narrative, but the specific daily hardships of a human being required to be in a place that was cold in ways that the body does not adapt to, that was dangerous in the specific, unpredictable way that occupation, duty in a hostile environment is dangerous. And that was far from everything that constituted home in the most immediate and practical sense. The language, the food, the relationships, the accumulated familiarity with an environment that makes daily existence legible rather than requiring constant navigation of the unfamiliar. The occupation's administration revealed the specific limits of Chinese strategic planning in the same way that all military occupations reveal the limits of the planning that produced them through the gap between what the plan had anticipated and what the reality of holding a position in an occupied civilian environment actually required. The plan had been organized around the relatively swift achievement of the resource objectives, the securing of the pipeline infrastructure, and the establishment of Chinese control over the petroleum supply it represented, within a time frame that the sustained American military response had extended far beyond what the planning had specified as the operational duration. The longer the occupation continued, the more the gap between the plan's assumptions and the occupation's operational reality widened, and the wider the gap widened, the more the specific human costs of maintaining the occupation accumulated on both sides among the Chinese forces, holding a position that was proving more difficult to hold than anticipated. Among the Anchorage civilian population, managing daily life inside an occupation that was extending beyond any reasonable expectation of its duration, and among the American military forces that were developing the response, whose eventual execution would end the occupation at the cost that ending it required. What the occupation produced in its Alaskan civilian population across the years of its duration was the specific transformation that sustained military occupation always produces in the people living within it, the gradual reorganization of daily life around the occupation's requirements, the development of the specific practical knowledge about how to navigate the occupation authority's rules and tolerances that survival in an occupied environment requires, and the specific psychological adjustment to circumstances that had been imposed without consent and that could not be changed through any individual action, but had to be managed through the daily practice of living within them. Some Anchorage civilians collaborated with the occupation authority to degrees that ranged from the practical accommodation of people who needed the occupation's cooperation to survive, to the more active forms of assistance that some individuals provided for reasons that the full range of human motivations, economic interest, ideological sympathy, coercion, the specific vulnerability of people with family members in positions that the occupation authority could make more or less difficult, could produce. Some resisted, in the forms available to civilians in an occupied city, the provision of information to American military forces, the protection of individuals the occupation authority was looking for, the small daily acts of refusal that occupation resistance typically takes when the options for more dramatic resistance are unavailable or too costly, most simply endured, doing what people in impossible circumstances have always done, managing the immediate requirements of daily life within whatever constraints the circumstances imposed, and waiting for those circumstances to change in whatever direction they were going to change. The specific moral complexity of the Anchorage occupation is the moral complexity of all military occupations conducted by forces whose government's decision to send them has been driven by the specific logic of resource competition, rather than by any simple desire to harm the people they are occupying. The Chinese forces at Anchorage were not there because their government had decided to harm Alaskans. They were there because their government had decided that the resource their civilization required was located in a place that another government controlled, and that military force was the most direct available instrument for resolving the competition, and that the people living in the specific geographic location where the resource infrastructure was situated were, in the arithmetic of that decision, a variable that could be managed within acceptable parameters, rather than a consideration that could be given the weight that their individual humanity warranted. The occupation was not conducted with gratuitous cruelty. The available evidence does not support that characterization, but it was conducted with the specific indifference to civilian welfare that military operations conducted, in service of strategic objectives other than civilian welfare, reliably produce, because the civilian welfare was not the objective. The pipeline was the objective. The civilians were the environment within which the objective was being secured. The cold at Anchorage was not the cold of a temperate winter that has extended beyond its expected duration or dropped below its expected temperature. It was the cold of a specific geography at a specific latitude, the cold of Alaska in the years around 2077, which the pre-war climate disruptions had made unpredictable in ways that the operational planning for the campaign had not adequately incorporated, producing conditions that varied from the merely brutal to the genuinely incompatible with sustained human presence in the field, without the specific technological support that the conditions required. A temperature reading does not convey what cold of that magnitude actually is, as an operational variable does not convey the specific way it degrades the human body's capacity for the physical and cognitive functions that combat requires. The specific rate at which it converts the manageable discomfort of cold weather exposure into the medical emergency of hypothermia, the specific effect it has on the mechanical and electronic systems that military operations depend on, the specific additional demand it places on every logistical system that is already operating under the strain of supporting a military force in a difficult theatre of operations. The cold at Anchorage was not an atmospheric condition that soldiers experienced alongside the other operational demands of the front. It was itself an operational demand, a sustained requirement imposed on every person and every system present in the theatre that competed directly with every other operational requirement for the limited energy and resources available to meet them. The terrain that shaped the Anchorage front's tactical character was the terrain of a specific place whose geography had been formed by geological processes over timescales that had nothing to do with military convenience. The mountains that dominated the landscape to the north and east of the city created natural defensive barriers that channeled movement along specific routes whose choke points and exposure to observation and fire that defenders had learned to exploit and the attackers had learned to identify and address, creating the specific tactical stalemate that characterized extended periods of the front's history. The tundra that extended across significant portions of the operational area was not the firm ground that wheeled and tracked vehicles required to operate effectively. It was a surface that the weight of military equipment converted into the specific obstacle of bogged machinery, whose trafficability varied with temperature and precipitation in ways that made the operational planning for vehicle movement a continuous recalculation rather than a settled question. The river systems and the coastal geography added additional constraints that planners on both sides had to incorporate into their operational thinking, constraints that in some cases created opportunities and in others created limitations that shaped where positions could be established and where they could not, where supplies could be moved, and where the terrain made movement too costly to attempt. The front line itself, the specific physical boundary between the territory under American military control and the territory under Chinese military control, was not a clean line on a map, but a lived reality in a specific landscape, a series of positions established in the terrain that was available and defensible, rather than the terrain that would have been preferred, held by specific people doing the specific daily work of maintaining a military position against both the environment and the enemy. The American positions along the front had the character that all forward military positions acquire across extended occupation, the specific combination of fortification and improvisation that develops when people are required to kind of qualify, make a specific place livable for purposes it was not designed to serve, when the immediate requirements of survival and operational function have to be met with whatever materials are available in the specific location. The fortifications that had been constructed against the cold were not always the same fortifications that were optimal against the enemy, and the fortifications that were optimal against the enemy were not always the fortifications that were best suited to managing the weather, and the people living in those positions were required to navigate this tension between the different forms of threat through the daily practice of making decisions about resource allocation in conditions where the resources were never adequate to all the requirements simultaneously. The supply situation that American forces along the front managed was the supply situation of a military force operating at a significant distance from its primary logistical base in conditions that degraded every component of the supply chain that operated within them. The fuel that powered the vehicles and the equipment and the heating systems, which were not optional luxuries in the Alaskan conditions, but operational necessities, without which the force's capacity to function would collapse. Within hours had to be transported from supply depots through routes that the terrain and the weather made unreliable in ways that no amount of planning could eliminate. The food that sustained the soldiers had to be transported with the same unreliability along the same routes, supplemented in some cases by the specific field rations that the military's food procurement had developed for cold weather operations, and that the soldiers who ate them evaluated with the specific opinion that people form about food that has been optimized for caloric density and shelf stability in extreme conditions, rather than for the qualities that make food something other than fuel. Nuka-Cola was present in the supply chain. A corporate partnership had ensured that its bottles and their familiar branding, a specific small connection to the world outside the front, that the soldiers received with whatever combination of appreciation and irony that the specific circumstances of their position produced in people who understood the distance between the marketing that had designed the brand and the reality in which they were consuming the product. The medical infrastructure that managed casualties along the front was the medical infrastructure of a military force conducting sustained operations in conditions that generated medical emergencies through multiple simultaneous mechanisms. The combat wounds from engagement with Chinese forces, the cold injuries that accumulated among soldiers whose exposure to the environment had exceeded what their protective equipment and their physical reserves could manage. The psychological casualties that the sustained stress of frontline duty in these conditions produced across time in ways that were less immediately visible than the physical casualties, but were no less real in their impact on the FIFE force's operational capacity. The forward aid stations that provided the initial response to casualties were positioned as close to the front as the tactical situation permitted, staffed by medical personnel who were performing sophisticated interventions in conditions that no medical training program had been designed to prepare them for operating in the cold with limited equipment, on patients whose injuries had been compounded by the exposure that the time between wounding and treatment had produced, making decisions under conditions that the controlled environments of medical education and the relatively well-resourced environments of rear area hospitals had not adequately represented. The treatment of cold injuries, the frostbite, the hypothermia, the specific constellation of medical problems that cold weather combat produces in the bodies of people who have been in the field long enough for the cold to have done significant damage, required interventions that were not always available in the forward environment, and that, when they were available, had to be performed under conditions that made their execution significantly more difficult than the clinical standards governing them had anticipated. The psychological conditions of the front were the psychological conditions of sustained exposure to an environment that generated threat through multiple, simultaneous channels, without providing any reliable mechanism for rest from the FIFE awareness of those threats. The combat stress that the front produced in the soldiers who endured it was not the acute stress of specific traumatic events, though those events occurred and produced their own specific psychological consequences, but the chronic stress of an environment in which the threat was always present and the relief was always partial and temporary. Soldiers who had been on the front for extended periods developed the specific adaptive responses that sustained high-threat environments produce in people who have been in them long enough: the hypervigilance, the emotional numbing, the specific cognitive patterns of constant threat assessment that become automatic through repetition, and that carry costs in the psychological dimensions of the person's experience that the tactical dimensions of the adaptation do not acknowledge or address. The specific loneliness of the Alaskan front, the distance from home, from the people and places and routines that constituted ordinary life, the specific isolation of a forward position in a landscape that did not offer the ordinary comforts of human habitation, was its own form of psychological pressure, adding to the cognitive and emotional load that the threat environment was already imposing, and that the soldiers were managing with whatever internal resources they had brought to the front and whatever they had developed in the specific conditions of being there. What the Anchorage front produced, across the years of its duration, was a specific population of people who had been shaped by those conditions in ways that were as fundamental and as permanent as any other formative experience that shapes a human being, shaped by the cold and the threat and the fineness, isolation and the specific daily demands of survival in an environment that was actively hostile through multiple simultaneous mechanisms, carrying in their minds and their bodies the accumulated record of what the front had required of them. They were not the heroes of the propaganda. They were not the simplified figures of the simulation. They were specific human beings who had been sent to a specific place and required to endure specific conditions for specific purposes. And what those conditions had done to them was the specific human cost of a resource war that the civilization conducting it had chosen to represent through the frameworks of heroism and national purpose, rather than through the honest accounting that the people who paid the cost deserved. The T-45 power armor did not arrive at Anchorage as a fully developed technology whose operational parameters had been established through extensive field testing in conditions comparable to those it would be required to perform in. It arrived as a technology that was, in the specific sense that matters most for understanding what it did and did not provide to the soldiers who wore it, still being discovered, still in the process of revealing through operational deployment the specific gap between what its designers had anticipated it would do and what the conditions of an Alaskan frontline actually required of it. The pre-war military's development of powered infantry armor had been proceeding along a trajectory that the resource war's escalating demands had accelerated beyond the pace that rigorous development and testing normally required, because the gap between what the conventional infantry could do and what the Alaskan front's conditions demanded had become wide enough that the command structure was willing to accept the specific risks of deploying technology that had not been fully proven in exchange for the tactical advantages that even a partially proven version of the technology could provide. This decision, the decision to field the T-45 at Anchorage before the development program had reached the point where the technology's limitations were fully understood and adequately addressed, was not a departure from sound military decision-making in the specific context of the resource war's final phase. It was the expression of a rational calculation about the relative costs of deploying immature technology against the costs of continuing to conduct operations without it in conditions where the absence of its advantages was producing casualties at rates that the command regarded as unacceptable. What the T-45 provided in its Alaskan deployment was a specific set of capabilities whose value in the front's particular conditions was genuine and significant, without being the transformative military advantage that the fruit propaganda subsequently claimed it had been. The thermal management systems, built into the suit's primary structure, provided meaningful protection against the cold meaningful, in the specific sense that they reduced the rate at which the wearer's body lost heat to the environment, extended the operational duration that a soldier could maintain in forward positions before the cold began degrading their physical and cognitive function, and addressed one of the front's most consistent sources of non-combat casualties by providing a technological buffer between the human body and the specific temperature conditions that had been producing frostbite, hypothermia among conventionally equipped soldiers at rates that the medical infrastructure was struggling to manage. The armor plating that constituted the suit's protective outer structure provided genuine ballistic protection against the small arms fire that constituted the dominant form of direct threat along the front line, not invulnerability, which the propaganda's mythologization of power armor tended to imply, but a meaningful increase in the survivability of engagements that would otherwise have been lethal, a shift in the arithmetic of the tactical encounter between an armored infantryman and an adversary equipped with standard infantry weapons that favored the armored soldier in ways that translated into reduced casualty rates in the specific engagement types that the Anchorage front most commonly produced. The strength augmentation that the T-45 servo systems provided the mechanical amplification of the wearer's physical force that allowed a soldier in power armor to carry loads and operate equipment that would be impossible or unsustainably demanding for an unaugmented human being was valuable in the specific operational environment of the Alaskan front in ways that the suit's designers had anticipated and in ways they had not. The anticipated value was in the obvious applications, carrying heavier weapons and more ammunition, moving through terrain that depth of snow and difficulty of gradient would have made prohibitively exhausting for an unaugmented soldier, performing the physical labor of fortification, construction, and position maintenance in conditions where the cold was already imposing a significant physical demand on everyone engaged in outdoor activity. The unanticipated value emerged from the specific operational conditions of the Alaskan front's engagement patterns, the ways in which the terrain channeled combat into close quarters situations where the physical advantage, that augmented strength, provided translated directly into tactical outcomes, and the ways in which the T-45's bulk and acoustic signature, which in other operational environments might have been disadvantages, became less significant in a landscape where sound propagation was already distorted by weather conditions and where the thermal signature of any operating military equipment was present, regardless of whether power armor was part of the force's equipment. The soldiers who received T-45 suits at Anchorage did not, in the majority of cases, receive them in circumstances that permitted the extended familiarization that the technology required for effective employment. The training programs that had been designed for power armor integration assumed timelines and training environments that the operational urgency of the Alaskan situation did not permit, assumed the availability of qualified instructors in numbers that the rapid expansion of power armor deployment had outstripped, assumed the existence of adequate maintenance, support infrastructure that the forward deployment had not yet established, assumed a rate of technology introduction that the command's assessment of the tactical situation had determined was too slow to be acceptable. The result was a population of power armor operators who were learning the technology's capabilities and limitations through operational experience rather than through the structured development of proficiency that the training programs had been designed to provide, discovering in the specific conditions of the front what the suits could do and what they could not do, what maintenance they required, and what happened when that maintenance was not performed, what the physical and psychological demands of extended operation in power armor actually were as distinct from what the technical documentation had specified. The physical demands of extended T-45 operation were among the technology's most significant unanticipated costs. Unanticipated not in the sense of being unknown to the people who had designed the system, whose technical documentation addressed them, but in the sense of being systematically underweighted by the military planners who had decided to deploy the technology at Anchorage in the specific operational tempo that the front's requirements demanded. Operating in power armor for extended periods imposed a specific physiological load on the wearer that was qualitatively different from the load of wearing conventional military equipment, but that was not zero. Micro-corrections that the body's proprioceptive systems made in response to the suit's movements and resistances across hours of continuous operation produced a cumulative muscular fatigue that was distinct from, but not less significant than, the fatigue of conventional physical exertion. The cognitive load of maintaining awareness of the suit's operational status, monitoring the power cell levels, the thermal management system's function, the status indicators for the various subsystems whose failure would degrade the suit's protective function, added to the overall cognitive demand of operating in a combat environment in ways that the soldiers managing both simultaneously experienced as a specific quality of divided attention, that neither task could receive the undivided focus that each individually required. The logistical reality of maintaining power armor in the Alaskan forward operational area was the logistical reality of sustaining sophisticated military technology in conditions specifically designed by geography and weather to degrade. Sophisticated technology cold that affected lubricants and seals and electronic components in ways that accelerated the maintenance cycle. Moisture that infiltrated systems whose environmental sealing had been designed for field conditions that the Alaskan theater exceeded. Physical stresses from the terrain and the operational tempo that wore components at rates that the maintenance schedules derived from less demanding conditions had not adequately planned for. The technicians responsible for maintaining the T-45 suits in the forward area were performing work that the technology's designers had not fully anticipated would need to be performed in the specific conditions of an Alaskan winter, with the specific constraints on available tools and replacement parts and workspace that forward area maintenance imposes on all equipment maintenance, regardless of the equipment's sophistication. Some suits were consistently operational. Some operated with degraded function across extended periods because the maintenance they required could not be performed in the field with the resources available. Some were cannibalized for parts to keep others operational, a resource allocation decision that was rational in the specific circumstances of the forward area and that gradually reduced the total operational power armor inventory through a process of managed degradation that was invisible in the aggregate statistics of suits deployed, but was visible to the soldiers and technicians managing it on the ground. What the T-45's deployment at Anchorage established that extended beyond the immediate tactical consequences of having armored infantry available in that specific theater was the foundational precedent for the pre-war. The world's subsequent investment in power armor technology as a primary instrument of American military power, a precedent that shaped the development priorities and the resource allocation decisions of the military-industrial complex across the years between Anchorage and the bombs, producing the progression of power armor variants that the wasteland preserved as the most visible technological legacy of the civilization that had been destroyed. The T-45 at Anchorage demonstrated that powered infantry armor was operationally viable in the most demanding conditions the pre-war military had yet deployed it in, not flawlessly, not without the significant costs and limitations that the operational experience had revealed, but well enough to establish the technology's foundational utility and to generate the institutional momentum that carried the development program forward through the T-51 and beyond. The specific lessons that Anchorage taught about what power armor needed to do better than the T-45 had done the thermal management improvements, the energy efficiency gains, the maintenance, accessibility enhancements were the lessons that shaped the subsequent development trajectory, making the Alaskan front's specific operational experience the direct precursor of the more capable systems that the pre-war military deployed in the years that followed. The propaganda that surrounded the T-45's deployment at Anchorage constructed a version of the technology's performance that served the recruitment and morale purposes the propaganda was designed to serve, rather than the accurate assessment of what the technology had actually demonstrated. The image of the power-armored soldier at Anchorage that appeared in the posters and the newsreels and the radio broadcasts was not the image of a technician managing a maintenance cycle on a system whose energy cells needed replacement, or a soldier learning through operational trial and error how to navigate terrain in a suit whose balance characteristics were still being understood, or a forward area maintenance crew performing field repairs on degraded seals in temperatures that made the work physically punishing and technically marginal. It was the image of a figure of technological triumph, armored, powerful, invulnerable in the specific way that propaganda imagery requires its subjects to be, embodying the nation's technological superiority over an adversary who was presented as relying on the kind of conventional infantry capability that American technology had transcended. This image was not entirely false. The T-45 did provide genuine advantages, and the soldiers who wore it were genuinely more capable in specific respects than they would have been without it. But the image was false in the ways that matter most, which is to say, false about the costs and the limitations and the specific human reality of what operating that technology in those conditions actually required of the people doing it. The people the United States military sent to Anchorage were not a random cross-section of the pre-war American population, though the specific demographic character of the force that ended up on the Alaskan front is a subject that the surviving records address with less completeness than the tactical and equipment records of the campaign. What the available evidence establishes is the broad outline of who was present, the combination of career, military personnel whose professional commitment to service had placed them in the force before the Anchorage campaign became the defining operational priority, the draftees whose conscription into the military had been produced by the specific manpower requirements of a campaign that the voluntary force alone could not sustain at the scale the front demanded, and the volunteers whose motivations ranged across the full spectrum of reasons that individuals choose military service in conditions of national emergency patriotism in the genuine sense, economic necessity in the specific form that the resource war's effects on the civilian economy had produced, family tradition, the specific forms of personal desperation and ambition and idealism that military service has always attracted from the populations it draws on. They came from the full geographic range of the pre-war United States, though the specific recruitment patterns of the draft system and the volunteer recruitment apparatus produced regional concentrations in the force's composition that reflected the specific economic and demographic conditions of different parts of the country. They were, in the most fundamental sense of the observation, ordinary people, people whose lives before the military had contained the ordinary combination of aspiration and limitation, relationship and loss, hope and disappointment that constitutes the texture of ordinary human existence, and who had been removed from those lives by the specific mechanism of military service and placed in the specific extraordinary circumstances of the Alaskan front. The process of becoming a soldier at Anchorage, the transformation from civilian to military personnel capable of functioning in the specific conditions of that front, was a process that the pre-war military's training infrastructure had not been fully designed to produce at the scale and pace that the campaign's manpower requirements demanded. The basic training programs that had been developed in conditions of peacetime planning assumed timelines and resources that the operational urgency of the Alaskan situation compressed and constrained, producing soldiers who had the fundamental skills and physical conditioning that training was designed to develop, but who had not had the extended practice in those skills or the gradual development of the operational instincts that longer training periods produced. The cold weather training component of preparation for Alaskan service was particularly vulnerable to this compression. The development of genuine competence in cold weather survival and operations required the kind of extended exposure to the relevant conditions that accelerated training programs did not have time to provide, meaning that soldiers arrived at the Alaskan front with theoretical knowledge of cold weather procedures and limited practical experience, applying them in conditions that were significantly more demanding than any training environment had been. What the specific conditions of the Anchorage front did to the people who arrived in it, what the sustained exposure to cold and threat and isolation, and the specific operational demands of the front line produced in the human beings who endured it, was a transformation that is traceable in the records that survive from the campaign, and that is visible in what the veterans of the front carried back with them into the civilian world that those records do not fully document. The transformation was not uniform. Different people responded to the same conditions in ways shaped by the specific character they had brought with them, the specific experiences they had before the front, the specific relationships they formed within the unit that provided whatever social support the front's conditions permitted. But across the variation in individual responses, certain patterns emerge that the accumulated evidence of extended exposure to those specific conditions consistently produced in the people exposed to them. The bonds formed between soldiers at Anchorage had the specific quality of relationships forged in conditions that stripped away the social niceties and the performative dimensions of ordinary human interaction and produced in their place the specific intimacy of people who depended on each other for survival in the most literal and immediate sense available. A soldier whose position partner fell asleep on watch in temperatures that could produce hypothermia within an hour was not dealing with a professional failure in the administrative sense. They were dealing with a potentially lethal situation whose management required the kind of immediate and personal intervention that no bureaucratic relationship produced. The mutual knowledge that accumulated between soldiers, sharing a forward position knowledge not only of each other's tactical capabilities and professional habits, but of each other's fears, the specific ways each person's psychology manifested under sustained stress, the particular comfort each person drew from particular rituals and particular subjects of conversation, was knowledge of the intimate kind that sustained proximity in high-stress conditions produces between people who are paying enough attention to the people around them to notice what is actually happening in those people, rather than what the professional relationship would specify as the relevant information. The specific psychological damage that the Anchorage front produced in the soldiers who served there accumulated across the duration of their service in ways that were not always visible in real time, not always visible even to the soldiers themselves, because the same adaptive responses that allowed them to function effectively in a high-threat environment also reduced their access to the internal states that the damage was affecting. The emotional numbing that sustained combat stress produces was not experienced as damage while it was functioning as an adaptation. It was experienced as the specific quality of detachment that allowed a soldier to perform functions that would be psychologically impossible for a person in full emotional contact with the reality of what those functions involved. The hypervigilance that the front produced, the specific attentional pattern of constant threat assessment that soldiers developed through extended exposure to an environment where threats could materialize without warning, and where the failure to detect a threat in time carried lethal consequences, was experienced as competence, as the appropriate level of alertness for an environment that warranted it, rather than as the specific form of nervous system dysregulation that it also was. The specific psychological costs of these adaptations became visible primarily in the conditions that did not obtain at the front, in the relative safety of leave periods and rear area assignments, and, ultimately, in the return to civilian life that the end of service produced, when the adaptations that had been appropriate to the front's conditions were applied to environments that did not warrant them. The soldiers documented in the lore that the Fallout universe preserves from the Anchorage campaign are not representative in any statistical sense. They are the specific individuals whose specific circumstances produced records that survived the 2 centuries between the front and the wastelands present, whose stories are available not because they were typical, but because the specific form of their experience produced some kind of documentary trace that the wastelands archives preserved. But they are instructive in the way that specific cases are always instructive about general patterns, because the specific things they document about their experience of the front are recognizable as particular instances of the front. Broader patterns that the front's conditions consistently produced, the isolation, the cold, the specific quality of the relationship between the soldiers and the command structure that sent them orders from positions that were not positions on the front line, the specific forms of coping that the front's conditions made available, and the specific costs of those coping mechanisms. These are present in the individual records in the specific form that individual experience takes, and they point toward the general experience of the Anchorage front as something that was genuinely, specifically, and in many cases, permanently costly to the people who went through it. The treatment of Anchorage veterans by the pre-war society that had sent them to the front was the treatment that the pre-war world's specific combination of genuine gratitude and systematic avoidance of uncomfortable truths produced in its relationship to the people who had paid the costs of its military campaigns. The genuine gratitude was real. The public appreciation for what the veterans had done was not fabricated, was not simply the performance of a society that privately regarded the people it had sent to fight as expendable and was managing the optics of that expenditure. It was the authentic, emotional response of a population that understood at some level that what had been asked of these specific people was extraordinary, and that what they had provided in response had been genuinely valuable. The systematic avoidance was equally real. The specific mechanisms through which the society managed its relationship to the actual content of the veterans' experience, to the specific damage the front had produced in the people who had served there, to the honest accounting of what the campaign had cost, and what it had achieved that the propaganda's triumphalist framing made systematically unavailable. Veterans who wanted to talk honestly about what they had experienced at Anchorage were talking into a social environment that had been prepared to receive the heroic version of their experience, and that was not well equipped to receive the version that the experience had actually been. The gap between what they had lived through and what the society was prepared to hear about it was its own specific form of isolation, different in character from the isolation of the front, but related to it in the specific way that the aftermath of war relates to the war itself, as the continuation by other means of the distance between the soldier's reality and the civilian's understanding of what that reality had contained. What the Anchorage veterans carried back to the pre-war world in their bodies and their psychology, and the specific ways their experience of the front had reorganized their relationship to ordinary life, was the specific cost of a resource war that the civilization had chosen to represent through the frameworks of heroism and sacrifice, rather than through the honest accounting that would have required acknowledging what had actually been required of the people sent to prosecute it. The simulation that the pre-war military eventually constructed to memorialize the Anchorage campaign was not built to preserve the honest account. It was built to preserve the heroic one, to provide an experience of the reclamation as triumph, as clean tactical achievement, as the kind of military action that produces pride and inspiration, rather than the specific, complex response that the honest account of what happened at Anchorage and what it cost the people who were there would have produced in anyone willing to engage with it fully. The soldiers who deserved the honest account got the simulation instead. What they had actually endured, the cold and the fear and the specific daily grind of survival in an environment that was actively hostile through every available mechanism, remained in the specific places it had been deposited, which is to say in the minds and bodies of the people who had been there, in the records that survived without being amplified by any institutional effort at honest preservation, and in the wastelands landscape where the evidence of what the front had been remained present for anyone willing to look at it with the specific attention that honest historical engagement requires. The honest account of the Anchorage campaign requires the specific moral effort of looking at the people on the other side of the front line with the same quality of attention that has been applied to the people on the American side. Requires acknowledging that the Chinese soldiers who occupied Anchorage and who held the front line against the American military's response were human beings whose individual humanity was no less real and no less morally significant than the individual humanity of the Americans who were trying to kill them, and that the specific conditions of their experience of the Alaskan front were not less costly because they were on the wrong side of the American propaganda apparatus's moral accounting. This acknowledgement is not a political position about the resource wars or the relative merits of the competing nationalisms that produced them. It is a basic observation about what human beings are. The observation that the Chinese soldier, shivering in a forward position along the Anchorage perimeter in the winter of 2074, was a person with specific history and specific relationships and specific fears and specific hopes, that the cold affected his body the same way it affected the body of the American soldier in the equivalent position on the opposite side of the front line, and that the specific circumstances that had placed him in Alaska rather than at home constituted a cost extracted from a specific human life by the specific logic of a resource war that his government had decided was necessary and that he had been given no meaningful opportunity to decline. The People's Liberation Army soldiers who served at Anchorage came from a China that the resource wars had been transforming across the preceding 2 decades in ways that the soldiers themselves had grown up within, and that constituted the specific social and political reality of their formation as people and as soldiers. They came from a country whose leadership had been managing the specific pressures of resource scarcity through the combination of internal controls and external acquisitions that the situation had made available, whose population had been living with the specific quality of controlled information about what the nation was doing and why that the Chinese government's information management apparatus produced, and whose understanding of the Alaskan campaign was organized by a narrative framework that their government had constructed for the same purposes that the American government had constructed its own narrative framework to make the campaign, costs of the campaign, acceptable to the population, bearing them by providing an account of the campaign's necessity and its progress that the honest account would not have supported. The Chinese soldier going to Alaska understood his service through this framework as the defense of his nation's legitimate resource requirements against the American imperialism that had been organizing its competition for those resources, as the fulfillment of his obligation to a nation whose survival the campaign was serving. The framework was not more or less honest than the American framework. It was the specific ideological instrument of a different side in the same resource competition, performing the same function of making the human cost of the competition bearable to the humans who were paying it. The distance from home that Chinese soldiers at Anchorage experienced was the distance from a specific civilization whose language and food and social practices and physical environment were not present in Alaska in any form that the soldiers could access a distance that operated not just as geography, but as the specific psychological condition of sustained removal from everything that constituted home in the most immediate and practical sense. The American soldiers at Anchorage were also far from home, but they were far from a home that existed within the same broad cultural and linguistic framework as the military organization they served within, far from a home whose newspapers and radio broadcasts and cultural products reached them through the supply chain and the communications infrastructure in forms that maintained some connection to the world they had left The Chinese soldiers were far from a home whose cultural products and information environment required translation to reach them, whose specific texture, the food, the language, the particular social dynamics of Chinese communities was not replicable in the Alaskan operational environment and was accessible only through the letters and the limited communications channels that the military permitted, and that the distance and the communications infrastructure of the period made unreliable. The homesickness that this distance produced was not a weakness or a failure of military discipline. It was the ordinary human response to sustained removal from everything that constituted home, experienced by people who were required to manage it, alongside everything else the front was demanding of them. The specific hardships of supply that Chinese forces at Anchorage experienced were the hardships of a military force operating at the far end of a supply chain that stretched across the Pacific, and through the specific vulnerabilities that the American military's efforts to interdict Chinese supply had introduced into every link. The food that reached Chinese forward positions had been subjected to the specific degradations of a long supply chain operating under interdiction pressure, arriving in quantities that were sometimes adequate and sometimes not, in conditions that the transit had affected in ways that reduced their nutritional value and their palatability, representing the specific end state of a logistics process that had been designed with optimistic assumptions about the reliability of each link and that was performing under conditions that had not been optimal at any link. The ammunition and the fuel and the replacement parts for equipment that Chinese soldiers required to maintain their operational capacity were subject to the same supply chain vulnerabilities, meaning that the decisions about what to prioritize in the limited supply capacity that was reliably available food or ammunition, fuel or equipment parts, were decisions that the front's commanders made with the specific awareness that every prioritization decision meant that something else was being deprioritized, and that the consequences of the prioritization would be felt by specific people in specific ways. The cold that Chinese soldiers experienced at Anchorage was the same cold that American soldiers experienced, because the cold did not make political distinctions between the people it affected. The specific cold weather equipment that Chinese forces had been issued reflected the military's assessment of what the Alaskan operational environment required, and that assessment had been made with the same combination of accurate technical understanding and optimistic institutional assumptions about operational conditions that characterized American cold weather equipment procurement, meaning that the equipment was genuinely better than nothing, that it provided meaningful protection against cold that would otherwise have been even more damaging, and that it was not fully adequate to the conditions of an Alaskan winter at the specific temperatures and exposure durations that sustained frontline operations produced. The cold injuries among Chinese forces, the frostbite and the hypothermia, and the specific medical emergencies that the temperatures produced in people whose protective equipment had been overwhelmed by the conditions were the same kinds of injuries produced by the same mechanism as those among American forces. The medical personnel managing those injuries were doing the same work in the same difficult conditions as the American medical personnel managing their equivalents on the other side of the front. The Chinese soldiers who died at Anchorage, who were killed in the engagements along the front line, who died of their wounds in the field hospitals and the aid stations, who died of cold injuries in forward positions when the conditions exceeded what their bodies and their equipment could manage, were people whose deaths constituted the same kind of specific loss to the specific people who had known them as the deaths of American soldiers constituted to the people who had known them, the parents and the siblings and the partners and the friends who had said goodbye to them when they deployed and who received the notification of their deaths through whatever mechanism the Chinese military used for this purpose were people in specific grief over specific losses, not abstractions, not the faceless enemies of American propaganda, but the specific human beings whose relationship to the specific dead soldier was the relationship that grief attaches itself to when someone who mattered is gone. The propaganda of both sides required its audience to hold the other side's dead at a distance that the propagandist's own dead were not held at, required the specific cognitive operation of understanding one's own dead as specific people with specific losses, and the other side's dead as the undifferentiated enemy, whose elimination was the tactical objective. The honest account refuses this operation. It applies the same quality of attention to everyone who died in the cold of Alaska, regardless of which side of the front line they were standing on, when the cold or the combat or the distance from adequate supply finally became more than what their body could continue to sustain. The evidence that survives in the Fallout universe's landscape and records about the specific experience of Chinese forces at Anchorage is fragmentary and mediated through the American perspective that dominates the available sources. Present in the physical evidence of Chinese positions and equipment in the operational area, in the records that the American military generated about its adversary, and in the specific artifacts that the Chinese presence in Alaska left in the landscape that 2 centuries of post-war conditions preserved. What that fragmentary evidence suggests about the human experience of the Chinese forces at Anchorage is consistent with what the general conditions of their situation would predict: the specific combination of resilience and hardship, of genuine commitment to the mission alongside the genuine costs that the mission imposed, of ordinary human beings managing extraordinary circumstances with whatever resources they had available. They were not the faceless enemy of the simulation's account of them. They were people in a specific terrible place, doing what they had been sent to do, dying for a resource that the bombs of October would render permanently irrelevant 9 months after the campaign that had cost them so much was ended by the force that had been organizing its response since the occupation began. The honest account owes them that acknowledgement. It is not much. It is what is available. And the availability of any honest account at all is itself evidence against the specific form of historical violence that propaganda performs on the people whose humanity it is designed to make invisible. The propaganda that surrounded the Anchorage campaign was not produced by people who understood themselves to be producing propaganda. This is the foundational fact about how the pre-war American information apparatus managed public understanding of the Alaskan front. The fact that the people who made the recruitment posters and wrote the radio scripts and selected the newsreel footage and approved the Nuka-Cola advertising copy that tied the brand to the front's imagery were people who understood themselves to be performing the legitimate functions of their respective professional roles, and who were performing those functions within institutional frameworks that had been designed to produce a specific kind of public understanding of the war, without ever requiring anyone within those frameworks to make a conscious decision to deceive. The deception was structural rather than individual, produced by the systematic selection and arrangement of true information in ways that served the purposes of those doing the selecting, rather than by the manufacture of false information that required its producers to understand themselves as liars. The recruitment poster that showed a power-armored soldier against the Alaskan landscape with a caption promising that American technology was winning the war was not factually false in any specific claim it made. It was false in the way that the selection of one true thing from among many true things is always false when the selection is made to serve a purpose other than comprehensive accuracy. False in what it omitted, in what it chose not to show alongside what it showed, in the specific impression it was designed to create in the person looking at it. The pre-war American information environment in the years of the Anchorage campaign was not a monolithic propaganda state, in the sense that the most extreme forms of information control produce. It was a media landscape in which the government's account of the war was the loudest and most persistent voice, without being the only voice in which the specific combination of official communications, corporate media coverage, and the regulatory and economic pressures that the government could bring to bear on media organizations that deviated too significantly from the official account produced an information environment that was highly convergent on the key points of the official narrative without having been centrally coordinated into that convergence through any single explicit mechanism. The radio stations that broadcast the government's messaging were not all government-operated. They were private commercial entities whose commercial interests aligned with broadcasting content that their audience found compelling and that did not attract the specific forms of regulatory attention that divergence from the official narrative could produce. The newspapers that covered the Anchorage campaign were not censored in the explicit sense of having their content reviewed and modified by government officials before publication. They were shaped by the specific combination of access journalism, source relationships, economic pressures, and the editorial judgment of people who had internalized the same framework for understanding the war that the official messaging had constructed, and who therefore produced coverage that was convergent with the official account, not because they had been ordered to, but because they understood the war through the same lens that the official account provided. The iBot network that the pre-war American government deployed across the landscape served functions that extended beyond military and administrative communication into the specific domain of ambient information saturation, the maintenance of a consistent information environment in which the government's account of the world was not merely available but inescapable, present in the specific locations and at the specific frequencies that ensured its messages reached the maximum proportion of the population in the daily contexts of their ordinary lives. The specific content that the iBots broadcast was not primarily about Anchorage. They broadcast the full range of government messaging about the resource wars and the domestic situation and the various other dimensions of the pre-war world's official narrative. But the Anchorage campaign was consistently present in their content as a recurring reference point, the specific military engagement whose progress and meaning the government's messaging most consistently invoked as evidence for the broader claims it was making about the war, American technological superiority, and the justification for the sacrifices the wartime conditions were extracting from the civilian population. Nuka-Cola's relationship to the Anchorage campaign represented the specific form of corporate government information alignment that the pre-war world had developed into one of its most effective propaganda instruments. The alignment of commercial messaging with military messaging in ways that made each reinforce the other without requiring explicit coordination between them. The images of Nuka-Cola that appeared in the contexts of the Anchorage front, the specific association of the brand's cheerful iconography with the cold heroism that the front's propaganda framing had constructed, served both parties' interests through the same mechanism. The government received the association of its military campaign with a beloved commercial brand whose positive affect transferred to the military context, and Nuka-Cola received the association of its brand with the specific form of national purpose and communal identity that wartime provides to the products that successfully attach themselves to it. The soldiers who drank Nuka-Cola in the forward positions were not primarily thinking about marketing when they opened the bottles. They were drinking something sweet and familiar in an environment that offered few sweet, familiar things. And the brand's association with home and with normalcy was not a manipulation of their response in any simple sense, but a genuine function of what the product and its branding had come to represent through years of marketing that had successfully tied the brand to those associations. But the machinery that had produced that association, the specific commercial and institutional choices that had made Nuka-Cola the beverage that appeared in military rations and that featured in the imagery of the front, was not operating in the interests of the soldiers who were drinking it. It was operating in the interests of the corporation that had made those choices, and the government whose messaging the corporation's choices served. The American civilian population, whose understanding of Anchorage was mediated by this information environment, was not a passive recipient of the official account in the sense of having no independent access to any other account. They had the veterans who returned people who had been there, whose direct experience of the front was available as testimony to anyone who asked, and whose testimony was inevitably different from the official account, in ways that the official account could not fully suppress, even as the social environment around the veterans made honest testimony about what the front had actually been like, a complicated proposition. The gap between the official account and the veterans' accounts was not absolute veterans who told the heroic version of their experience, or who had experienced the front in ways that were consistent with the heroic version, or who had developed, for whatever combination of reasons, the specific form of public presentation of their experience that aligned with the official account, were part of the information environment that civilians encountered. But the veterans who had been genuinely damaged by the front, whose visible, psychological, and physical costs were inconsistent with the triumphalist imagery of the official account, who could not or would not perform the version of their experience that the official account required, these veterans were also part of the information environment, and what their presence communicated to the civilians who encountered them was information that the recruitment posters did not contain. The Homefront's economic relationship to the Anchorage campaign was the economic relationship of a civilian population managing the specific conditions that wartime resource allocation imposed on daily life, the fuel rationing that restricted mobility and heating, the food price inflation that reflected the agricultural sector's petroleum dependency, the specific combination of material shortage and official optimism that the pre-war government managed through the same information mechanisms it applied to military reporting. The civilians who were experiencing these conditions in their daily lives were not, in most cases, making the direct connection between the conditions they were experiencing and the specific military and corporate decisions that had produced them, were understanding their situation through the official framework that attributed the shortages to the war's necessary demands, and the official account's implicit promise that the war's success would eventually restore the conditions that the shortages had disrupted. This attribution was not entirely false. The resource wars were genuinely producing the conditions that civilians were experiencing, but it was incomplete in the specific way that official accounts of uncomfortable truths are. Always incomplete, omitting the dimensions of causation and decision-making that would complicate the simple moral narrative of national sacrifice in service of national survival. What the propaganda constructed around the Anchorage campaign ultimately produced in the American public's understanding of the resource wars was not a population that was immune to the truth about what the wars were costing and what they were achieving, but a population whose relationship to that truth was mediated through a framework that made the comfortable version of it the version that was most available and most persistently reinforced. The discomfort that required suppression was not primarily about the campaign's military dimensions, the casualties, and the conditions, and the specific operational realities that the sanitized account had replaced with heroic imagery. It was about the fundamental question that the resource wars posed about the civilization conducting them, the question of what a civilization revealed about itself when its response to resource scarcity was to prosecute the competition for remaining resources through military force, and what the specific costs of that choice said about the values the civilization actually operated by, as distinct from the values it claimed to hold. The propaganda's function was not simply to manage public understanding of the military campaign. It was to manage public understanding of what the civilization conducting the campaign was, to maintain the coherence of the story the civilization told about itself in conditions that the honest account of what it was doing would have made that story impossible to sustain. The Anchorage reclamation was not, in the account that the propaganda constructed and that the operation, Anchorage simulation, subsequently preserved, a military operation conducted at significant human cost against a prepared defensive force that had been holding its position for years. It was, in that account, a triumph, the clean, decisive assertion of American military power and technological superiority that expelled the Chinese occupation and restored the pipeline infrastructure to American control. demonstrating through the specific evidence of its success that the sacrifices the Alaskan campaign had required had been worth their cost. This account was not wholly false. The reclamation was a military success in the specific sense that it achieved its primary operational objective. Anchorage was retaken, the Chinese forces were expelled from the positions they had held, and the pipeline infrastructure was returned to American control. These were real outcomes, achieved through real military operations, and the people who planned and executed those operations demonstrated genuine competence in achieving them. But the propaganda's account of the reclamation was false in the ways that matter most: false about the human cost of achieving those outcomes, false about the specific conditions under which the achieving was done, and false about what the achievement meant in the context of the broader resource war that had made the Anchorage campaign necessary. The specific military situation that preceded the reclamation was the situation of an American force that had been developing its operational capacity for a major offensive against a prepared defensive position across the months and years of the front's existence, developing it in the specific conditions of the Alaskan theater, with the specific resources that the supply chain had made available, against the specific defensive architecture that Chinese forces had been constructing and improving across the duration of their occupation. The Chinese forces that the reclamation was designed to expel had not been sitting passively in the positions they had established at the beginning of the occupation. They had been improving those positions across the years of the occupation's duration, constructing the specific defensive infrastructure that a force expecting to be attacked builds when it understands that attack is coming and has the time and the materials to prepare for it, the hardened positions and the layered defenses and the specific tactical arrangements that make a prepared defensive force significantly more costly to assault than the same force in unprepared positions would have been. The American military planning for the reclamation had to account for this defensive preparation in the specific tactical approach it developed, had to find the combination of power armor, infantry, conventional forces, supporting fires and operational timing that could overcome prepared defenses at acceptable cost. General Chase's operational plan for the reclamation reflected his specific understanding of what the operation required, an understanding shaped by his extended engagement with the Alaskan theater's conditions, his assessment of Chinese defensive capabilities and their specific limitations, and the particular operational philosophy he had developed across his military career. The plan was aggressive in the sense that aggressive plans for offensive operations against prepared defenses typically are. It accepted the costs of directness in exchange for the decisive outcomes that indirect approaches would have achieved more slowly and at less predictable cost. The power armor infantry that constituted the plan's primary assault element was assigned to the tasks that the T-45's capabilities made it most suited for: the direct assault against hardened positions whose conventional infantry equivalent would have been prohibitively costly, the movement through terrain whose difficulty was reduced by the augmented strength and cold weather protection that the suits provided, the specific close-quarters engagement with prepared defensive positions that the suit's protection made survivable for the soldiers inside them in circumstances that unsuited infantry would not have survived. The conventional forces that supported the power armor assault performed the functions of fixing Chinese forces in positions that would otherwise have been able to concentrate against the armored assault, of securing the flanks that the armored assault's momentum could not protect, of exploiting the gaps that the armored assault created in the Chinese defensive architecture. The human cost of the reclamation was the human cost of an offensive operation against a prepared defensive force in conditions that made every dimension of the operation more demanding than the equivalent operation in more favorable circumstances would have been. The power armor's protection reduced casualties among the assault elements without eliminating them. The armor degraded through the engagement. Individual suits failed or were damaged to the point of reduced protection, and the specific forms of attack that Chinese forces deployed against armored infantry were the forms that a capable defensive force develops when it understands that the attacking force's primary capability is armored, anti-armor weapons, indirect fire against positions rather than individuals, the channeling of armored movement into engagement zones where the armor's advantages were reduced. The conventional forces that supported the assault took casualties at the rates that offensive operations against prepared positions reliably produce when the operational conditions do not permit the kinds of supporting fire that reduce defensive resistance before the assault goes in. The cold added its specific casualties to the combat casualties, people who were wounded and whose exposure in the time between wounding and treatment produced cold injuries that compounded the combat injury. People whose operational demands across the extended engagement period exceeded what their cold weather equipment and physical reserves could sustain. The Chinese forces defending Anchorage during the reclamation fought with the specific quality that forces defending positions they have been ordered to hold against superior assault typically demonstrate not the enthusiasm of an attacking force pursuing an objective it has chosen, but the grim determination of people who have been told their position must be held and who are doing what that order requires in conditions that make the holding increasingly difficult. The casualties they sustained across the reclamation's engagement were the casualties of a defensive force that was being systematically reduced by an assault with material advantages, the power armor, the operational initiative of the attacker, the accumulated American logistical advantages that had been developed across the front's history and that translated into operational capacity advantages at the point of the assault. The Chinese soldiers who died defending positions along the Anchorage perimeter during the reclamation were dying for the same resource objectives that had sent them to Alaska in the first place, objectives whose achievement the reclamation was making impossible by expelling the force that had been sent to achieve them from the territory they had been sent to hold. The specific individuals among them, the platoon commanders who organized the final defensive stands in positions that were being overrun, the soldiers who continued engaging the American assault until engagement was no longer possible, the wounded who were captured or left behind as the Chinese forces' organized resistance collapsed into the specific, disorganized retreat that a defensive force that has been broken executes through whatever routes the terrain and the tactical situation leave available, were human beings experiencing the specific terror and determination and exhaustion and grief that the final phase of a lost defensive battle produces in the people who are living through it. The reclamation's conclusion, the moment when Anchorage was fully under American control and the Chinese forces had been expelled from the positions they had held since the occupation began, was experienced differently by different people in different positions. For the American military command, it was the achievement of the operational objective that the campaign had been organized around the specific success that justified the costs of the campaign, and that the propaganda would subsequently amplify into the triumphalist narrative the simulation would preserve. For the American soldiers who had fought through the reclamation's engagement, it was the end of the immediate threat and the beginning of the specific, exhausted relief that surviving an intense military operation produces not the clean triumph of the propaganda's imagery, but the specific, mixed state of relief and grief and physical exhaustion and the processing of what had just been required and what it had cost that people who have been through genuine combat experience when the immediate demand is over. For the Chinese forces, it was defeat in the specific military sense, the loss of the position they had been holding, the expulsion from the territory their nation had sent them to secure, the beginning of whatever came next in a campaign that had not achieved the objectives that had justified its costs. For the Anchorage civilian population, it was the end of an occupation that had organized their lives for years and the beginning of the specific, uncertain conditions of a city transitioning from occupied status to American military control, not an immediate return to normalcy, but the beginning of a process whose duration and character were not yet clear, and whose management would require the specific combination of military administration and civilian resilience that the transition from occupation to liberation always requires. What the reclamation actually accomplished in the context of the broader resource war that had produced the Anchorage campaign was a significant but not decisive shift in the strategic situation, the restoration of American control over the pipeline infrastructure, the elimination of the Chinese military presence in continental North American territory, and the specific message that the success sent to both sides' leadership about the military balance and the viability of continued Chinese resource acquisition efforts through military means in the American theater. It did not end the resource wars. It did not resolve the resource scarcity that had produced them. It did not address the fundamental arithmetic of declining petroleum supply that had made the competition for what remained a military matter. That arithmetic continued operating according to its own logic, regardless of what had happened at Anchorage, and the civilization that had celebrated the reclamation as a triumph was still the civilization that was running out of the resource whose control the triumph had been fought over. 9 months after the reclamation, the bombs fell, and the question of who controlled the Alaska pipeline became permanently moot in the specific way that only nuclear exchange can make a question permanently moot, by eliminating both the resource and the civilization that had organized a war around its control. General Constantine Chase occupies a specific position in the history of the Anchorage campaign that is distinct from the position the simulation subsequently assigned him, distinct in the specific sense that the simulation's account of his leadership and the honest account of what the available evidence suggests about his command approach are not the same account, and the distance between them is one of the most revealing measurements available of what the pre-war military's information apparatus was doing when it constructed the operation. Anchorage simulation as a memorial to the campaign. The simulation's Chase is a figure of decisive competence, a commander whose tactical intelligence and operational judgment produced the reclamation's success, and whose specific approach to the campaign's challenges is presented as the model of military leadership that the simulation is designed to teach and to celebrate. The Chase that emerges from the fuller account that the honest engagement with available evidence supports is a more complicated figure, a military commander of genuine operational capability whose specific understanding of the figure, campaign's requirements, and his own authority within it produced decisions whose human cost the simulation's account systematically omits. Chase's operational philosophy was the philosophy of a military commander who had developed his understanding of what military operations required in the specific conditions of the resource war's escalating demands. Conditions that had been progressively selecting, across the decades of their duration, for the specific combination of operational aggressiveness and willingness to accept human cost that the war's character required of the commanders who prosecuted them successfully. The commander who was cautious about human cost, who allowed the specific weight of the casualties his decisions produced to shape his operational choices in ways that reduced tactical effectiveness, was a commander whose operational record in the resource wars tended to be less distinguished than the record of the commander who made those choices with the specific kind of moral efficiency that treated human cost as a variable to be optimized rather than a consideration that could override tactical requirements. This was not a culture that Chase had created. It was the specific institutional culture that the resource wars had produced in the pre-war American military. And Chase was both a product of that culture and one of its more successful expressions, a commander whose operational record was the record that the culture's selection pressures rewarded. The specific decisions that the available law documents about Chase's command at Anchorage reveal the specific character of his leadership in ways that the simulation's heroic presentation does not. His treatment of Chinese prisoners, the specific approach to captured enemy personnel that his command authorized and implemented, reflected the specific moral calculus of a commander who understood prisoners primarily as resources and liabilities, rather than as human beings with rights that the laws of armed conflict specified, and that his command was obligated to observe regardless of operational convenience. The specific intelligence value that prisoners could provide about Chinese defensive arrangements and operational plans was a genuine operational asset, the kind of information that could reduce American casualties by improving the accuracy of the tactical planning that shaped how the assault went in. The specific cost of obtaining that information, through whatever means the command's interrogation protocols authorized, was a cost that Chase's command calculated as acceptable against the operational benefit. Whether the specific means authorized were means that the applicable legal frameworks governing the treatment of prisoners permitted is a question that the honest account of his command cannot avoid asking, and that the simulation's account of his leadership is specifically designed to make unavailable. His relationship to the soldiers under his command was the relationship of a commander who understood his force primarily as the instrument through which operational objectives were achieved, who genuinely wanted to reduce casualties, to the extent that reducing them was compatible with achieving the objectives, because unnecessary casualties were a waste of operational capacity that could be directed toward the objectives, but who did not allow the weight of casualties to shape his operational choices in ways that reduced the probability of achieving the objectives. The soldiers under his command experienced his leadership through the specific medium of the orders and the operational conditions that his decisions produced, through the specific demands his plans placed on the force, through the specific casualties those plans generated, through the specific quality of the relationship between the command's understanding of the campaign and the frontline reality that the soldiers who were executing the command's plans inhabited. The gap between those two understandings, between the operational picture available to Chase in his command position and the operational reality experienced by the soldiers in the forward positions, was the gap that characterizes all military command in conditions of imperfect information, and Chase's navigation of that gap had the specific character that his operational philosophy produced: confident in the operational direction despite the uncertainty, willing to accept the human cost that the direction required, focused on the objective that justified the cost. The propaganda apparatus that surrounded Chase's command built a version of his leadership that served the specific purposes of wartime messaging, a version that emphasized the competence and the decisiveness and the operational intelligence while systematically omitting the specific dimensions of his command style that the honest account made available. The Chase of the posters and the radio broadcasts and the official military communications was the Chase that recruitment required the figure of inspiring command authority whose operational judgment had produced success in the most demanding theater of the war and whose example demonstrated what American military leadership could achieve. The Chase of the honest account, the commander whose operational decisions produced the reclamation's success at the specific human cost those decisions required, whose treatment of prisoners reflected the specific moral framework of a command culture that the resource wars had produced, whose relationship to the soldiers under him was the relationship of a man who understood those soldiers primarily as the instrument of objectives, larger than any individual, was not available in the official account because the presentive is money. Official account was not designed to produce honest understanding. It was designed to produce specific feelings and specific behaviors in the specific population it addressed, and the Chase required to produce those outcomes was not the Chase that the honest account describes. His subsequent appearance in the Operation Anchorage simulation, or rather, the simulation's version of him, the digital construct that the simulation's designers built to represent his command presence within the virtual recreation of the reclamation, is perhaps the most precise available measure of what the pre-war, the military's institutional memory had decided to preserve about the campaign's commander. The simulation's Chase is decisive, clear-sighted, focused on the objective, authoritative in his communication of the operational direction and his expectation of its execution. He is the Chase that the institutional mythology required. The commander whose leadership the simulation is designed to teach as the model of what military command at its best looks like. What the simulation's chase does not contain is the specific complexity of the actual chase's command record, the decisions whose human cost the official account had not found it useful to preserve, the specific dimensions of his leadership style that the honest account makes visible, and that the simulation's pedagogical purposes required be made invisible. The simulation did not preserve chase. It preserved the chase-shaped object that the institutional mythology had constructed, the specific version of a specific person that the pre-war military's information apparatus had determined served its purposes, emptied of the specific human and moral complexity that the honest account of the actual person contained. What Chase's career and its commemoration in the simulation ultimately reveals about the pre-war military's relationship to its own history is the specific pattern of institutional self-management that all military organizations perform around the commanders and the campaigns that constitute their institutional legacy, the selective preservation of the dimensions of that legacy that serve the current institutional purposes, the systematic suppression of the dimensions that complicate the institutional narrative, the construction of the version of the past that the institution requires, rather than the version that the honest engagement with the available evidence would produce. This is not unique to the pre-war American military. It is what institutions do with their histories, when the honest account of those histories would undermine the institutional identity that the mythology is designed to sustain. What distinguishes the pre-war military's management of the Anchorage legacy is the specific scale and the specific technological sophistication of the commemoration it produced, the construction of an entire simulation, environment dedicated to preserving a specific version of the campaign and making that version experientially available to the people the institution wanted to shape through access to it. The simulation was not simply a history. It was an argument, a specific, immersive, technologically sophisticated argument for a particular understanding of what the Anchorage campaign had been and what it meant, designed to be persuasive in the specific way that immersive experience is persuasive, rather than in the way that historical argument is persuasive, and therefore significantly more resistant to the critical engagement that historical argument invites than any text or any conventional commemorative form could have been. It was propaganda in its most advanced available form, not the poster on the wall or the broadcast from the iBot, but the total environment that placed the participant inside the version of events that the institution wanted them to experience as real. The soldiers who deserved the honest account got the simulation. The simulation gave them something more compelling and less true. And the gap between those two things, between what the honest account contains and what the simulation preserved, is the specific measure of what the pre-war world chose to do with the history of the people it had sent to. The cold. The simulation presents itself as memory, but it is not memory. It is arrangement. It is selection. It is the careful removal of everything that makes memory difficult to carry, and the preservation of everything that makes it easy to display. When you step into Operation Anchorage, you are not stepping into the war that was fought in Alaska. You are stepping into the version of that war that the pre-war world decided it could live with. The structure of the simulation tells you this immediately, if you are willing to look at it as something constructed rather than something remembered. The objectives are clean. The environment is hostile in appearance, but not in consequence. The cold exists as a visual language: snow, ice, the suggestion of discomfort, but it does not function as the constant, grinding force that shaped every decision made by the people who were actually there. In the real Anchorage, the cold was not background. It was an adversary that could not be defeated, only endured. It broke equipment. It consumed energy. It turned small mistakes into fatal ones. In the simulation, the cold is reduced to scenery. It is something to move through, not something that reshapes the act of moving itself. This is not an accident. It is a choice that reveals the purpose of the simulation. To include the cold as it actually functioned would be to include the uncertainty, the attrition, the slow erosion of human capacity that it produced. It would be to include the way that the environment blurred the line between combat casualty and environmental casualty until the distinction became irrelevant to the people experiencing it. The simulation removes this because it cannot be easily framed as victory. It cannot be cleanly assigned to heroism or failure. It is simply cost, and cost without narrative function is something the simulation is not designed to preserve. The same is true of the enemy. In Operation Anchorage, the Chinese soldiers are present, but they are not people, they are targets. They move, they fire, they fall, but they do not exist as individuals, with histories, with fears, with the same fundamental relationship to survival that defined the Americans who fought them. Their presence is necessary for the structure of the simulation, but their humanity is not. In fact, their humanity would interfere with the function of the simulation, because it would introduce a moral complexity that cannot be easily resolved within the framework of a controlled experience designed to reinforce a particular interpretation of the past. In the real Anchorage, the Chinese soldiers were as cold as the Americans. They were as far from home. They were operating under orders, shaped by the same logic of desperation that had sent the Americans to oppose them. None of this is present in the simulation, because to include it would be to acknowledge that the conflict was not a simple opposition between good and evil, but a collision between two systems responding to the same underlying pressures. The simulation does not have space for that kind of symmetry. It requires asymmetry. It requires one side to be the subject and the other to be the object. Even the structure of the missions reflects this transformation. The objectives are clear, sequential, and achievable within a defined time frame. There is no sense of the prolonged uncertainty that characterized the actual campaign. There are no long stretches of waiting, punctuated by moments of violence. There is no sense of supply lines stretching thin, of equipment failing at the worst possible moment, of decisions made with incomplete information under conditions that degrade the ability to think clearly. The simulation replaces all of this with a series of discrete challenges that can be overcome through skill and determination. This creates a version of the war that is legible. It can be understood, completed, and, most importantly, repeated. The repeatability is essential. Memory, in its original form, is not repeatable in this way. It changes, it degrades, it resists precise reconstruction. The simulation eliminates this instability. It fixes the war in a form that can be experienced identically each time, producing the same sequence of events, the same outcomes, the same sense of progression toward a defined conclusion. That conclusion, the reclamation of Anchorage, is presented as inevitable. The player moves toward it with the confidence that success is not only possible, but expected. This is perhaps the most significant departure from reality. In the actual campaign, there was no inevitability. There was planning, there was preparation, there was execution, but there was also uncertainty at every stage. The outcome was contingent on factors that could not be fully controlled. The simulation removes this contingency. It presents victory as the natural result of the actions taken within its framework. General Chase, as he appears in the simulation, is central to this construction. He is decisive, confident, and aligned perfectly with the objectives that the simulation sets. There is no ambiguity in his decisions, no indication of the moral compromises or the willingness to accept human cost that characterized his real-world command. The simulation preserves his authority, but refines it, removing the elements that would complicate his role as a figure of leadership. He becomes an embodiment of the narrative the simulation is designed to convey, that the campaign was directed by clear vision and executed with precision toward a justifiable end. What is absent is as important as what is present. There are no moments where the cost of decisions is allowed to linger. There is no space for the consequences of orders to be examined beyond their immediate tactical effect. The soldiers under his command exist within the same framework as the player, They act, they succeed, or fail in discrete tasks, but they do not carry forward the accumulation of experience that would, in reality, define their understanding of the war. Their suffering, if it exists at all within the simulation, is abstracted into the mechanics of health and damage, quantities that can be restored or managed without lasting consequence. The simulation also alters time. The Anchorage campaign, in reality, unfolded over an extended period, with phases of escalation and stagnation, with shifts in strategy and circumstance. Operation Anchorage compresses this into a sequence that can be completed in a single, continuous experience. This compression is not merely practical, it is interpretive. It removes the sense of duration that contributes to the psychological weight of the conflict. The war becomes an event rather than a condition, something that can be entered and exited without the lingering effects that prolonged exposure produces. This transformation has a purpose that extends beyond the immediate experience of the simulation. It reflects an institutional decision about how the war should be remembered. By preserving a version of Anchorage that emphasizes clarity, agency, and success, the simulation supports a narrative that justifies the actions taken and the costs incurred. It provides a framework through which the war can be understood as necessary and effective, rather than as a complex and deeply ambivalent response to a set of pressures that had no clean solutions. The existence of the simulation itself is a statement about the pre-war society that created it. It indicates a level of technological capability sufficient to construct detailed, immersive reconstructions of past events. It also indicates a willingness to apply that capability not to preserve the full complexity of those events, but to shape them into a form that aligns with institutional needs. The simulation is not an accident of preservation. It is an artifact of intention. When the Brotherhood of Steel encounters Operation Anchorage, they are encountering not just a piece of technology, but a piece of narrative engineering. They are stepping into a curated version of history that has been maintained with enough care to remain functional long after the society that created it has been destroyed. This persistence is significant. It suggests that the version of Anchorage encoded in the simulation was considered important enough to preserve beyond the immediate needs of training or morale. It was meant to endure. The contrast between the simulation and the physical remnants of the Anchorage campaign in the wasteland is stark. In the landscape itself, the evidence of the war is fragmented, incomplete, and often difficult to interpret. There are ruins, scattered records, traces of activity that hint at what occurred, but do not present it in a coherent narrative. This is what uncurated history looks like. It requires reconstruction. It resists simplification. It forces the observer to engage with uncertainty. The simulation offers the opposite. It provides coherence. It resolves ambiguity. It tells you what happened and why it mattered within the limits of its design. The danger lies in the ease with which this coherence can be mistaken for accuracy. The more complete and polished the simulation appears, the more it invites acceptance as a definitive account. The effort required to question it is greater than the effort required to accept it, and in a world where resources, including cognitive and emotional resources, are limited, acceptance becomes the default. What is lost in this process is not just detail, but understanding. The real Anchorage campaign was shaped by factors that do not translate easily into the structure of a simulation. The slow accumulation of fatigue, the unpredictability of human behavior under stress, the way that small decisions can have disproportionate effects when systems are already under strain. These elements are essential to understanding what the war was and what it did to the people involved. Without them, the campaign becomes something else entirely. The simulation also alters the relationship between the individual and the collective. In Operation Anchorage, the player occupies a central role, moving through the objectives with a level of agency that suggests individual action is the primary driver of events. In reality, The campaign was the product of collective effort, constrained by systems and circumstances that limited the impact of any single individual. By emphasizing individual agency, the simulation aligns with a narrative that prioritizes personal heroism over systemic analysis. This alignment serves a broader function. It reinforces the idea that the outcomes of the war were the result of choices made by capable individuals, rather than the result of structural conditions that limited those choices. It shifts responsibility away from the systems that created the conflict and toward the actions taken within it. This shift makes the war more palatable because it frames it as something that could be understood and controlled at the level of individual decision-making. The mythologizing of Anchorage through the simulation is not unique within the context of the pre-war world, but it is particularly clear in this case because of the contrast between the simulation and the available evidence of the campaign. The closer you look at the differences, the more apparent the underlying process becomes. It is a process of selection and omission, guided by the need to produce a narrative that can be sustained over time without generating the kind of critical engagement that might challenge its assumptions. The cost of this process is measured not only in the distortion of the past, but in the limitations it places on the ability to learn from that past. A sanitized account of a conflict does not provide the information necessary to understand the conditions that produced it or the factors that influenced its outcome. It provides reassurance, not insight. It allows the society that created it and those who inherit it to maintain a particular self-conception without confronting the elements of the past that would complicate that conception. Operation Anchorage, in this sense, is both a memorial and a barrier. It preserves a version of the campaign, ensuring that it is not forgotten, but it also restricts access to the aspects of the campaign that would require a more difficult engagement. It offers a story that can be told and retold without change, while the underlying reality remains fragmented and obscured. For those who encounter the simulation in the wasteland, the experience is shaped by the distance between their world and the world that produced it. They are not participants in the original conflict, and they do not carry the same cultural context that would have influenced its interpretation. This distance creates an opportunity, but it also creates a risk. Without the context to question the simulation, it can be accepted as a complete account. With the context, it can be recognized as a constructed narrative, one that reveals as much about the society that built it as it does about the event it depicts. The existence of Operation Anchorage suggests that the pre-war world was not only aware of the need to remember its conflicts, but also deeply invested in controlling how those conflicts were remembered. This investment reflects an understanding of memory as a resource, something that can be shaped to support particular outcomes in the present. It also reflects an awareness of the power of narrative to influence perception, to determine which aspects of the past are emphasized and which are allowed to fade. In the end, the simulation does not erase the reality of Anchorage, but it does create a competing version that is easier to access and easier to accept. The two versions coexist, one embedded in the landscape and the fragmented records that survive, the other preserved in a form that can be experienced directly. The tension between them is where the truth of the campaign can be found, not as a single, coherent story, but as the result of examining both the constructed narrative and the evidence it omits. To engage honestly with Anchorage is to move beyond the simulation without discarding it entirely, to recognize it as a product of its time and its purpose, and to use it as a point of comparison rather than a source of authority. It is to understand that what is presented is not the war itself, but a reflection of how that war was made acceptable to those who needed to believe in its necessity and its success. The myth of Anchorage, as preserved in Operation Anchorage, is not a lie in the simple sense. It is a reconfiguration, a selective truth shaped into a form that serves a function. The challenge is not simply to reject it, but to see it clearly, to understand what it includes and what it excludes, and to recognize the reasons for those choices. Only then can the distance between the myth and the reality be measured. And only then can the full weight of what happened in the cold of Alaska be understood in a way that does not depend on the comfort of a simplified narrative. And when you remain within the simulation a little longer, when you stop moving from objective to objective, and instead observe the edges of what has been constructed, you begin to notice something else. Not just what has been removed, but what has been simplified into something that no longer behaves the way reality does. The world inside Operation Anchorage is stable. It does not fray at the edges. Systems function as intended. Commands are understood, executed, and resolved without the friction that characterizes actual human interaction under stress. Even failure, when it occurs, is bounded. It does not spiral outward into consequences that cannot be contained. This stability is one of the most significant distortions the simulation introduces, because instability was one of the defining characteristics of the actual campaign. Equipment failed in ways that could not be predicted. Communications broke down at the worst possible moments. Orders were misunderstood, delayed, or rendered irrelevant by changing conditions before they could be carried out. The simulation cannot fully represent this without undermining its own structure, because instability resists scripting. It introduces outcomes that cannot be reliably reproduced, and reproducibility is essential to the simulation's function. So, the instability is removed, and in its place is a system that responds cleanly to input. Actions produce expected results. The relationship between cause and effect is clarified, simplified, and made consistent. This is not how the war was experienced by the people who fought it. For them, cause and effect were often separated by layers of uncertainty. A decision made in one context could produce consequences in another, far removed from the original intent. The simulation collapses these layers, bringing everything into immediate alignment. There is also the matter of silence, or rather, the absence of it. In the real Anchorage, silence was not neutral. It carried weight. It was the space in which anticipation grew, in which the mind moved ahead of the body and imagined outcomes that had not yet occurred. It was where fear accumulated, not always in response to a specific threat, but in response to the knowledge that a threat could emerge at any moment. The simulation fills this silence with activity. There is always a next objective, a next movement, a next engagement. The space for anticipation is reduced, and with it, the particular psychological pressure that prolonged uncertainty creates. This alteration changes the emotional texture of the experience. It transforms a condition of sustained tension into a sequence of manageable stresses. Each challenge is discrete, bounded, and resolvable. There is little room for the kind of diffuse anxiety that does not attach itself to a single event, but instead permeates the entire experience. In doing so, the simulation removes one of the most significant aspects of what it meant to exist on the Anchorage front. The sense that the danger was not only in what was happening, but in what could happen at any moment, without warning, without clear cause. Even the landscape itself is altered in subtle ways. It is rendered in sufficient detail to be recognizable, but it is also organized to support the movement of the player. Paths are clear enough to follow. Obstacles are placed in ways that create challenge without creating impasse. The terrain, which in reality imposed severe limitations on movement and often dictated the terms of engagement, becomes something that can be navigated with relative confidence. It still appears harsh, but its harshness is moderated by the needs of the simulation. In the actual Anchorage campaign, the terrain was not simply difficult, it was decisive. It determined where forces could go, how quickly they could move, what kind of support could be brought to bear, and whether that support would arrive in time to matter. It created situations where positions were held not because they were strategically optimal, but because they were the only positions that could be held given the constraints of the environment. None of this is fully present in the simulation. because it would require a level of unpredictability and limitation that would conflict with the design of a controlled experience. There is also a notable absence of aftermath. Engagements begin and end, but their consequences do not persist beyond the immediate moment. There are no lingering injuries that affect future actions, no cumulative degradation of performance that reflects the toll of sustained exposure to stress and environment. The player, like the soldiers within the simulation, operates at a relatively consistent level of capability from beginning to end. This constancy is another form of simplification, one that removes the long-term effects of the conditions being depicted. In reality, the Anchorage front was defined by accumulation. Fatigue accumulated, damage accumulated, psychological strain accumulated. Each day did not reset the conditions of the previous one. It added to them. The people who fought there carried the weight of what had come before into every new engagement. The simulation cannot easily represent this accumulation without fundamentally altering the experience it provides, so it replaces it with a series of isolated events that do not meaningfully interact with one another over time. The result is a version of the war that is, in a sense, weightless, not in the sense that it lacks difficulty or challenge, but in the sense that it does not carry forward the full burden of its own conditions. Each moment is experienced largely on its own terms, rather than as part of a continuous process that shapes and is shaped by everything that came before it. This weightlessness makes the experience more accessible, more manageable, and more easily integrated into a narrative of competence and control. But it also creates a distance between the experience and the reality it represents. That distance is not immediately obvious, especially to someone encountering the simulation without prior knowledge of the actual campaign. The surface details are convincing enough to suggest authenticity. The uniforms, the equipment, the general outline of events all align with what is known about the Anchorage campaign. It is only when you begin to examine how these elements interact, how they are structured and constrained, that the differences become clear. The persistence of this constructed version of Anchorage into the post-war world raises another question, one that extends beyond the specifics of the campaign itself. It asks what happens when a society's primary record of a significant event is not a direct account, but a curated representation. In the absence of competing narratives, or in the presence of limited evidence to challenge the constructed version, the representation can become the default understanding. It can shape how the event is interpreted, how it is integrated into broader historical frameworks, and how its lessons are understood. For the Brotherhood of Steel, and for others who encounter Operation Anchorage, the simulation is both a resource and a constraint. It provides access to a level of detail that might otherwise be lost, but it also channels that detail through a specific interpretive lens. To use it effectively requires an awareness of its limitations, an understanding that what it presents is not the totality of the event, but a particular version of it, shaped by the priorities and assumptions of those who created it. This awareness is not easily maintained. The simulation is designed to be immersive, to draw the participant into its world and encourage engagement on its own terms. Questioning its structure requires stepping back from that immersion, examining it as an artifact rather than experiencing it as an environment. This shift is cognitively demanding, especially in a world where immediate concerns often take precedence over reflective analysis. The easier path is to accept the simulation as it presents itself, to take its coherence as evidence of its completeness. But completeness is precisely what it lacks, not because it fails to include certain details, but because it is structured in a way that cannot accommodate the full range of factors that defined the actual campaign. It cannot include the contradictions, the uncertainties, the elements that do not resolve neatly into a clear outcome. These are not oversights. They are exclusions, necessary for the simulation to function as intended. In recognizing this, the simulation becomes something more than a flawed record. It becomes a window into the priorities of the pre-war world, into the way that world chose to understand and present its own actions. It reveals a preference for narratives that emphasize control, clarity, and success, even when the underlying reality was far more complex and far less certain. It shows a willingness to invest significant resources into the creation of these narratives, to encode them in systems that would outlast the society that produced them. There is a certain irony in this persistence. The world that created Operation Anchorage no longer exists, but the version of Anchorage it chose to preserve continues to function, continuing to present its account to anyone capable of accessing it. Meanwhile, the physical remnants of the actual campaign degrade, their meanings becoming harder to interpret as time passes. The curated narrative remains stable, while the uncurated reality fades. This imbalance has implications for how the past is understood in the post-war world. It suggests that the most accessible versions of history may not be the most accurate, and that the effort required to reconstruct a more complete account increases over time as evidence is lost and narratives become entrenched. It also suggests that the act of remembering is not neutral, but shaped by the tools and frameworks available to those doing the remembering. In this context, Operation Anchorage can be seen as both a preservation of history and a transformation of it. It ensures that the Anchorage campaign is not forgotten, but it also ensures that it is remembered in a particular way. The challenge, for those who encounter it, is to recognize both aspects, to use the simulation as a source of information while remaining aware of its limitations and its biases. To do this is to engage with the past in a more demanding way. It requires holding multiple perspectives at once, comparing the constructed narrative with the fragmented evidence of the real campaign, and accepting that the result will not be a single, unified account, but a composite, assembled from pieces that do not always align perfectly. It requires acknowledging that some aspects of the past may be irretrievably lost, while others are preserved in forms that obscure as much as they reveal. This kind of engagement does not produce the same sense of resolution that the simulation offers. It does not provide a clear endpoint, a definitive understanding that can be easily communicated or repeated. Instead, it produces a more nuanced, more uncertain understanding, one that reflects the complexity of the event itself. It is less satisfying in the immediate sense, but more faithful to the reality it seeks to understand. And perhaps that is the final distinction between the simulation and the war it represents. The simulation is designed to satisfy. It provides a complete experience, one that can be entered, navigated, and concluded with a sense of accomplishment. The war did not satisfy. It did not resolve cleanly. Its consequences extended beyond its own boundaries, contributing to a chain of events that culminated in a catastrophe that rendered its outcomes largely irrelevant. To rely solely on the simulation is to accept a version of Anchorage that fits within a framework of meaning that the pre-war world found acceptable. To look beyond it is to encounter a version of Anchorage that resists that framework, that demands a different kind of engagement, one that acknowledges the limits of narrative and the persistence of uncertainty. It is in that space, between the constructed memory and the fragmented reality, that the full weight of what happened in Alaska can begin to emerge, not as a story that can be neatly told, but as an event that continues to shape understanding long after the conditions that produced it have disappeared. And if you continue to examine the simulation not as an experience to be completed, but as an artifact to be understood, another layer begins to reveal itself: the way it teaches, without ever acknowledging that it is teaching. Every system inside Operation Anchorage is not only a representation, but an instruction. It tells you how to interpret what you are seeing. It guides your attention towards certain elements and away from others. It rewards particular forms of engagement and makes others either impossible or irrelevant. You are encouraged to move forward, to act decisively, to treat hesitation as inefficiency rather than as a rational response to uncertainty. You are trained, quietly, to understand the environment as something to overcome rather than something to negotiate with. You are shown a version of conflict in which clarity is available if you pursue it with enough determination, where confusion is a temporary obstacle rather than a permanent condition. These are not neutral lessons. They reflect a specific philosophy of war, one that privileges action over reflection, resolution over ambiguity. In the real Anchorage, hesitation could be survival. Slowing down, reassessing, choosing not to act immediately. These were not signs of weakness, but necessary adaptations to a situation where acting too quickly could expose you to dangers you had not yet perceived. The simulation cannot reward this kind of behavior because it disrupts the pacing, the structure, the sense of forward momentum that it is designed to maintain. So it removes the value of hesitation, replacing it with a model where progress is the primary measure of success. Even the way the simulation handles failure reveals its underlying purpose. Failure is temporary. It is correctable. You can begin again, approach the same situation with new knowledge, and achieve a different outcome. This reinforces the idea that the system is fair, that success is attainable through improvement and persistence. In reality, failure at Anchorage was often final. There were no second attempts, no opportunity to refine your approach based on what you had learned. The consequences of a mistake were not contained within a system that allowed for repetition. They extended outward, affecting others, altering the conditions of the environment, contributing to a chain of events that could not be undone. This difference changes the moral dimension of the experience. In the simulation, the stakes are bounded. You are aware, at some level, that the consequences of your actions are limited to the framework of the system. In the actual campaign, the stakes were unbounded in a much more immediate sense. The consequences of decisions were not abstract. They were experienced directly, often irreversibly, by the people involved. The simulation cannot replicate this without ceasing to function as a simulation, so it substitutes a controlled version of consequence that maintains the illusion of stakes without their full weight. There is also the matter of perspective. Operation Anchorage is experienced from a position that centralizes the participant. The world is organized around your movement through it. Events unfold in relation to your actions. This creates a sense of coherence, a feeling that the experience has a clear structure because you are the point around which that structure is arranged. It is a powerful way of making the experience understandable, but it is also a distortion. The real Anchorage campaign had no single central perspective. It was a network of experiences, each limited, each partial, each shaped by the specific position of the individual within it. No one saw the entire picture. No one had access to all the information necessary to fully understand what was happening at any given moment. The simulation replaces this distributed perspective with a unified one, not because it is more accurate, but because it is more manageable. It allows the participant to move through the experience with a sense of orientation that would not have been available to the people who actually lived it. This centralization has implications for how the campaign is understood. It suggests that the war can be grasped as a whole, that its events can be organized into a coherent sequence that leads from beginning to end. It implies that there is a narrative that encompasses the entire experience, one that can be accessed and understood from a single vantage point. In reality, any such narrative is constructed after the fact, assembled from pieces that do not naturally align. The simulation presents the constructed narrative as if it were inherent to the event itself. And then there is the question of what the simulation chooses to emphasize as meaningful. Certain actions are highlighted, certain objectives are framed as critical, certain moments are given weight through their placement and their consequences within the system. These choices are not arbitrary. They reflect a judgment about what mattered in the campaign, about which elements should be remembered and which can be minimized or excluded. Combat actions are central. Tactical successes are foregrounded. The movement of forces, the engagement with the enemy, the achievement of specific objectives, these are the elements that define the structure of the simulation. What is less visible are the processes that supported these actions, the logistics, the maintenance, the medical care, the countless tasks that did not involve direct engagement but were essential to the functioning of the campaign. These are present, if at all, only in abstracted form. This creates a skewed understanding of what the war required. It suggests that the primary activity was combat, that the defining moments were those of direct confrontation. In reality, much of the experience of Anchorage consisted of waiting, preparing, maintaining, enduring. The simulation compresses or removes these elements, not because they were unimportant, but because they do not fit easily into the structure of a compelling, interactive experience. Over time, this emphasis shapes memory. What is repeatedly experienced becomes what is most readily recalled. The simulation, by focusing on certain aspects of the campaign, increases their prominence in the collective understanding of the event. The quieter, less visible aspects recede further into the background, becoming harder to access, harder to integrate into the narrative. The fact that this process occurs within a system designed for repetition amplifies its effect. Each time the simulation is run, the same sequence is reinforced. The same actions are taken, the same outcomes are achieved. This repetition solidifies the constructed narrative, making it more resistant to challenge. It creates a sense of familiarity that can be mistaken for accuracy. Meanwhile, the aspects of the campaign that are not included in the simulation do not benefit from this reinforcement. They rely on other forms of preservation, written records, physical remnants, oral accounts, each of which is subject to degradation over time. As these sources become less accessible or less complete, the relative influence of the simulation increases. This imbalance does not erase the omitted aspects entirely, but it does make them more difficult to recover. It requires a deliberate effort to seek them out, to piece together fragments, to reconstruct a picture that the simulation does not provide. It requires a willingness to accept uncertainty, to work with incomplete information, to resist the clarity that the simulation offers in favor of a more complex and less satisfying understanding. In this way, Operation Anchorage becomes part of a larger pattern, one that extends beyond the specific context of the Anchorage campaign. It reflects a broader tendency to replace complexity with coherence, to substitute constructed narratives for the messy, often contradictory realities they represent. It is a response to the difficulty of engaging with events that do not resolve neatly, that resist the kinds of explanations that can be easily communicated and understood. But the need for coherence does not eliminate the underlying complexity, it simply obscures it. The reality of Anchorage remains, embedded in the landscape, in the scattered records, in the traces left behind by those who were there. The simulation does not overwrite this reality, but it does create a layer that must be seen through, a lens that shapes perception unless it is consciously set aside. To see through it is not to discard it, but to recognize it as one perspective among many, one that is particularly influential because of its clarity and accessibility. It is to understand that the story it tells is incomplete, that it serves a purpose that extends beyond simple preservation, and that engaging with it critically is necessary to approach a fuller understanding of the event it represents. The Anchorage campaign, as it existed, cannot be fully reconstructed. Too much has been lost. Too many details have faded beyond recovery. What remains is a combination of fragments and interpretations of evidence and narrative, each contributing to a picture that is necessarily partial. Operation Anchorage is one of the most complete of these interpretations, but it is also one of the most deliberately shaped, and so it stands in the post-war world as both a guide and a warning. A guide in that it provides access to a version of the past that might otherwise be inaccessible. A warning in that it demonstrates how easily that past can be transformed into something more manageable, more acceptable, and less true to the conditions that defined it. To engage with Anchorage honestly is to hold both of these aspects in mind, to use the simulation without being used by it, to recognize its value without accepting its authority. It is to understand that the distance between the memory it presents and the reality it represents is not a flaw to be corrected, but a space to be examined, a space where the choices of a society, the pressures it faced, and the ways it chose to respond to those pressures can be seen more clearly than in either the simulation or the fragments alone. In that space, the war becomes something other than a sequence of objectives completed and victories achieved. It becomes a reflection of a world under strain, a system pushed beyond its capacity to manage its own contradictions, and the people caught within it, doing what they could with what they had, in conditions that no simulation can fully reproduce. And when the telling is finished, when the structures of explanation begin to settle, and the weight of detail no longer needs to be carried forward, you are left with the place itself, or what remains of it. Anchorage does not remember in the way people do. It does not arrange its past into meaning. It does not select what is easier to hold and set aside what is not. It simply continues. The cold persists. The land holds what it was given, without preference, without interpretation. The front line, as it once existed, has dissolved into terrain. The trenches have softened, the fortifications broken, the paths once carved by necessity, reclaimed by the slow, indifferent processes that reshape all things given enough time. There is no clear boundary anymore between where the battle was fought and where it was not. The distinction mattered once. It mattered intensely. Now it has no function. The land does not preserve the line because the line no longer serves any purpose. What remains are fragments, pieces of equipment that no longer function, structures that suggest intention but do not explain it. Objects that were once held, used, depended upon, now separated from the context that gave them meaning. These fragments do not tell a complete story. They resist completion. They offer only the fact of their existence and the implication that something happened here that required them to be what they are. The cold, more than anything else, endures as it always has. It is not the same cold that was experienced by the people who fought here, because cold, like all things, is shaped by the conditions in which it is encountered, but it is continuous in a way that human experience is not. It does not carry memory. It does not distinguish between past and present. It simply exists, imposing the same fundamental constraint it always has. That survival here requires adaptation, and that failure to adapt carries consequences that cannot be negotiated away. There is a kind of quiet that follows this understanding, not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of distance. The events that defined Anchorage are no longer immediate. They do not press against the present with the urgency they once had. They exist as something that can be considered, examined, and, if one chooses, set aside. This distance makes reflection possible, but it also introduces a certain kind of loss. The immediacy of experience cannot be fully recovered. It can only be approximated through evidence and interpretation. What emerges from that approximation is not a single story, but a convergence of many partial ones. The American soldier in the cold, measuring each movement against the cost it might incur. The Chinese soldier, equally distant from home, equally constrained by the same environment, holding a position that had become something more than an objective and less than a place of belonging. The civilian population, whose lives were reorganized around forces they did not control, adapting in ways that do not easily translate into the language of military history. None of these perspectives is complete on its own. Each is limited, shaped by position, by information, by the conditions under which it was formed. To understand Anchorage is to accept these limitations, to resist the impulse to unify them into a single, coherent narrative that resolves their differences. The coherence that emerges from such a process is often more a reflection of the desire for understanding than of the reality being understood. And yet, there is a pattern that can be observed, not as a narrative imposed from above, but as a consequence of the conditions that produced the event. The resource wars created pressures that narrowed the range of available choices. Nations acted within those constraints, making decisions that were shaped as much by necessity as by intention. The individuals who carried out those decisions did so within systems that defined their roles, limited their options, and provided them with frameworks for understanding what they were doing. Anchorage was one point where these systems intersected in a particularly intense way. It was not unique in its existence, but it was specific in its conditions. The cold, the terrain, the strategic importance of the pipeline, these factors combined to create a situation that required a particular kind of response. The response, in turn, produced consequences that extended beyond the immediate context, contributing to the broader trajectory of a world already moving toward collapse. 9 months after the reclamation of Anchorage, the Great War rendered the outcome of the campaign functionally irrelevant. The control of the pipeline, the restoration of territory, the tactical successes and failures, all of these were subsumed by an event that redefined the scale at which consequences were measured. This does not mean that Anchorage did not matter. It means that its significance must be understood in relation to a larger pattern, one in which local victories and losses are part of a system that ultimately exceeded the capacity of its participants to control. There is a tendency to look back at such events and search for points where different choices might have led to different outcomes. This is not without value, but it must be approached with caution. The conditions that produced Anchorage were not easily altered. They were the result of long-term processes, resource depletion, political decisions, technological developments that had accumulated over time. To imagine a different outcome is to imagine changes at multiple levels, not just at the point of immediate action. What can be observed, with more certainty, is the way in which the systems involved responded to those conditions. The reliance on military solutions to economic problems, the use of propaganda to maintain public support, the development of technologies like power armor to extend human capability in environments that would otherwise limit it. These responses were effective in the short term, in the sense that they allowed the systems to continue functioning, but they also contributed to the trajectory that led to the final collapse. Anchorage, in this sense, is not only a story about what happened in a specific place at a specific time, it is a reflection of a broader pattern of behavior, one that can be observed in different forms across the pre-war world. It shows how systems under pressure tend to simplify their understanding of complex problems, to favor solutions that provide immediate relief, even if they introduce longer-term risks. It shows how individuals within those systems navigate the constraints they are given, making choices that are rational within their context, even if they contribute to outcomes that are destructive at a larger scale. The people who fought at Anchorage were not abstractions. They were not symbols of larger forces. They were individuals with their own histories, their own motivations, their own ways of understanding the situation they were in. The systems they were part of shaped their actions, but they did not eliminate their agency entirely. Within the constraints they faced, they made decisions, formed relationships, found ways to endure. To acknowledge this is not to assign blame or to absolve responsibility. It is to recognize the complexity of human behavior in conditions that do not allow for simple judgments. The same person could act with compassion in one moment and with violence in another, not because of a fundamental inconsistency, but because the situation demanded different responses. The same system could provide support in one context and impose harm in another, depending on how its priorities aligned with the needs of those within it. This complexity is often difficult to hold, especially when looking back at events that resulted in such widespread destruction. There is a desire to find clear lines, to separate actions into categories that can be easily understood and evaluated. But Anchorage resists this kind of simplification. It presents a situation in which the lines are blurred, where the same conditions that produce suffering also produce forms of resilience, where the same decisions that achieve short-term objectives contribute to long-term consequences that negate those objectives. In the aftermath, what remains is not a clear lesson, but a set of observations that can inform how similar situations might be approached in the future. The importance of recognizing the limits of military solutions to systemic problems, the need to account for the full range of costs associated with decisions, not just those that can be easily quantified. The value of maintaining perspectives that include the experiences of all those involved, rather than privileging a single narrative that serves particular interests. These observations do not provide certainty. They do not guarantee that similar patterns will not repeat, but they offer a way of engaging with the past that is more aligned with its complexity, that acknowledges the factors that contributed to the outcomes observed, and that resists the tendency to reduce those outcomes to simplified explanations. As the focus returns to the present, whatever the present is, in a world that has been so fundamentally altered, the significance of Anchorage shifts. It is no longer a current event, no longer a strategic objective or a point of contention. It becomes part of a larger landscape of memory and evidence, one of many sites where the past can be examined, where the consequences of previous decisions can be observed. The fire, wherever it is found, provides a contrast to the cold that defined Anchorage. It offers warmth, stability, a sense of enclosure against an environment that does not inherently provide those things. It is a small, controlled system, one that can be maintained with attention and care. In its presence, the distance between the observer and the observed becomes more apparent. The cold of Anchorage is not immediate. It is something that can be thought about without being endured. This distance allows for rest, not in the sense of forgetting, but in the sense of not being required to carry the full weight of the past at all times. The long watch continues, but it does not need to be constant. There are moments where the mind can settle, where the focus can shift from analysis to simple presence, from the reconstruction of events to the experience of being here, now, separate from what was. And yet, the connection remains. The understanding that what happened in places like Anchorage is part of the foundation upon which the present is built, even if that foundation is fractured, even if it does not support what it once did. The recognition that the patterns observed there are not confined to that time and place, that they have relevance beyond their original context. So you sit with it, not as a story that has been resolved, but as something that continues to unfold in understanding. The cold is far away, but it is not gone. The people who endured it are gone, but their experiences remain, in fragments, in records, in the spaces between what is known and what can only be inferred. Rest now, if rest is possible. Let the warmth hold for a while. The account has been given, as fully as it can be, within the limits of what remains. What is left is not a conclusion, but a continuation, a quiet recognition of what was asked, what was given, and what it meant in a world that no longer exists, but whose echoes persist in every place where the past has not been entirely erased.